tenemos a un gran invitado, Paul Polman. Paul es ex-CEO de Unilever y coautor de Net Positive. Paul trabaja para acelerar la acción de las empresas para lograr los ODS de las Naciones Unidas. Para entrevistar a Paul nos acompañará Manuel Pulgar-Vidal, líder global de clima y energía del WWF. Con más de 35 años de experiencia en Derecho y Política Ambiental, además ha sido ministro del Ambiente de Perú. Antes de darle el pase, les recuerdo que ese segmento se realizará en inglés, por lo que los participantes en línea que necesiten traducción al español, les pedimos que ingresen a la plataforma del evento y busquen la opción de traducción a español. Para ello, deberán elegir la ventana dentro del espacio en vivo. Bienvenidos Manuel y Paul, es realmente un placer que puedan formar parte de este evento.
Muchas gracias, Gianfranco, por la introducción, y para mí, como saben, es un placer participar el día de hoy en el evento Perú Sostenible, evento que considero de altísima importancia, no solamente para el sector empresarial peruano, sino para el Perú en sí. Y como saben, este segmento, esta sesión va a ser desarrollada en inglés. Gianfranco ya presentó a Paul, por lo cual yo voy a decir un par de frases muy importantes sobre Paul, y voy a pasar en este instante al inglés. So, it is for me a pleasure to be with you, Paul. Probably you don't know Paul, it is a great friend. It is a person that I met, I think the first time it was in 2013, probably just before of the COP19 that it was developed in Warsaw, in Poland. And with him, he used to be part of the Friends of the COP20 presidency, organized and hosted by Peru. But also with him, we were strongly instrumental to organize what it was called the Lima Paris Action Agenda. That it was the starting point of what it is the non-state actor role with a strong participation of the business sector. And I think that that decision has been one of those great decisions in the climate debate, because by now everybody knows that it won't be possible to implement well the Paris Agreement if it is not with the business sector and with the non-state actors that includes the academia, the civil society, the indigenous people, among some other actors. And let me add that Paul, it is a great leader. And for me, that is so important. We do need to have leadership, not only to address the challenges that the planet is facing, but more than that, to take and to mobilize action. Because this is about action, and that will be the common thread of today's session. How should we adopt and include in our daily activities climate responsibility and a strong, clear and concrete climate action? So this session will have two parts. Paul will make a short presentation, probably in between 10 to 15 minutes, and after that we will have 30 minutes, 35 minutes of an open and transparent conversation. So with that, let me introduce you, Paul, and give to you the floor. So the floor is yours, Paul.
No, muchas gracias, Manuel. Es un placer de estar aquí y me alegra mucho de visitar Perú y yo espero de hacer en el próximo futuro. El Perú Sostenible es un foro muy importante, porque es un momento decisivo por la humanidad. Y voy a explicar en inglés, como Manuel ha dicho. And your network that you have created with Peru Sustainable, if you want to, is an important opportunity to drive sustainable development in the country. And I'm happy to see that you're also the network partner for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, an organization that I chaired for 4 years. You believe very firmly in business being an agent for change, and that business, its investments, its resources, its people, its innovative capabilities, its financing possibilities are absolutely necessary to achieve this better future that we all aspire to. Like you, I believe that needs to be done in partnership. Business cannot do it alone, but certainly has an important role to play. I also want to thank the two co-presidents of this forum, which is Gianfranco Ferrari, as Manuel already mentioned, and Maria Antonieta Alba, for their support. But I'm especially pleased to do this together with my friend Manuel, who I got to know even better during the COP20. He's a very modest person, but I would say that the COP21, which was a great success in Paris, would not have been possible without the work that he did tirelessly during the year from the COP20 onwards. Usually, the COP is prepared probably 9 to 12 months before the actual event, as we saw in Glasgow with the COP26, as we saw in Paris at the COP21. And Peru, and with Manuel's leadership, I think should take quite a lot of credit for having had such a defining agreement in the world that has put climate change firmly on the map of everybody. Although we're still not where we need to be, I think we're in a much better place than we otherwise would have. And now with the WWF, an equally important organization, talk about partnership, that Manuel again is the driving force in bringing nature-based solutions on the agenda. So important for reaching our climate objectives. It cannot be done just with an energy transition. It also has to involve nature. And having seen WWF play a key role in the beauty of Peru and protecting nature, it was the one that helped establish your first natural reserve, the Pampa Caleras, but also the protection of other beautiful places like the Manu National Park, which I had the pleasure to visit, or the Paraguas National Reserve, and many other places in your beautiful country. You would agree with me that we're at a delicate moment for humanity, that the world is in trouble, and frankly, we can all see it. Climate change and inequality are probably the biggest challenges. This year, World Overshoot Day, which is the day that we use up more resources than the world can replenish, was July 28th, which frankly means that after that date, as far as I'm concerned, we're actually stealing from future generations. This world is 4.6 billion years old. If I put it on a scale of 46 years to make it simple, human beings have only been here for 4 hours. The Industrial Revolution only started 1 minute ago. And in that 1 minute, we have cut down 50% of the world's forests. In the last 5 decades, we've lost 68% of the world's mammals, vertebrates, amphibians. Some people call this the 6th greatest extinction. In fact, Hubert Reeves, who is a philosopher from Canada, said it very well when he said that man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. And I think with the pause of COVID, which I know has caused major tragedy in your country as well, I think a lot of people have started to realize that we cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet, that we cannot have healthy people on an unhealthy planet, that we are first and foremost citizens of planet Earth, and that issues like climate change or the pandemic don't know borders. And most importantly, I think we've realized that just to stay within our current economic system and trying to optimize and do our best only brings us so far. In order to attack these major challenges that we see, we need to have changes at a bigger order. And this is what we're going to talk about. Now, for Peru, this is very important. In fact, on biodiversity and nature, I would call you one of the best countries in the world, and potentially the best country that can benefit not only from tourism or the resources that nature gives, like your fishery or frankly mining and other things, but also in some of the new areas that we can develop, not least the nature-based solutions, the carbon credit markets, the sustainable tourism, and many more things. I think you're well placed because you are home of 70% of the world's biological diversity. Think about that. But on the other hand, you're also one of the most vulnerable countries towards the effects of climate change, with a population that mainly lives along your coast. 60% of the Peruvians do. Obviously, with water levels rising, that's not a good position to be in. You also depend a lot on agriculture, and our changing weather patterns is affecting agriculture. Your glaciers are melting, and they're playing such an important role in your ecosystem. 70% of your energy is already generated by water. And as we see now all over the world, the water patterns are being disrupted in enormous ways. And then obviously in Peru, the need, I would argue, is still high. Whilst you are an intermediate country, as the UN would call it, you still have about 45% of people living under what we would call the poverty levels. And for all these reasons, I think it's important that Peru plays an active role actually in helping us redesign what this economic system will look like. And you are actually paying the price already, directly or indirectly, in Peru, of the failures of many countries in the world to have acted until now. Take your severe floodings that you saw recently, or the landslides that came from it, which have affected more than 10,000 people in your country alone. And we know that that's just scratching the surface. Now, COVID has laid bare also some of the other shortcomings of our system. We've seen that globally as well. The failures of our healthcare system, the existence of structural problems that we have, problems in education in many places in the world, in the functioning of our economies, our governments. In fact, over 100 countries in the world have seen democracy go down since COVID. So that's not a good starting point. And for you, it is important with the challenges of being affected by climate change, but also the opportunities that it offers, that you play a very active role, not only in Peru itself, to right-size the economy and to move forward, but also equally importantly at the global scale, if I might say. These ecological or economic or geopolitical or trust challenges that have resulted in this enormous breakdown is an issue that cannot be solved by any individual organization, or by any government alone. This crisis of climate, of energy, of nature, of geopolitical tension, of the pandemic, and the list goes on, of inequality that affects billions of people around the world now, has to be solved by all of us together in a spirit of cooperation and partnership, more than at any time in history. And that requires trust. Trust in government, trust in business, trust in the institutions. And that obviously is at the moment, especially in Peru, as we have seen, with a rotating government that probably exceeds even the Italian government's history. It's very difficult to attack these issues. I realize that, but we cannot be defeatists and rejoice or not take responsibility. This actually is a moment for us to step up. And we have a global plan. It's called the Sustainable Development Goals, the ones that 193 countries approved in the UN in September 2015, with a simple goal to not leave anybody behind, to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. A powerful vision, by all means possible, but not only possible, also very profitable. We noticed that looking at just a few areas of the Sustainable Development Goals, we could unlock $12 trillion just in this decade alone and create jobs for 380 million people. And interestingly, the developing or intermediate markets, Peru included, actually would see the biggest benefits from that. As you well know, right now, because of COVID, but also of some of the other issues that we talked about, we're moving in the wrong direction. The UN estimates that because of the crisis in the Ukraine, the global food crisis, the global energy crisis, about 250 million more people will be pushed into poverty. We've also seen that on climate change, we are still well away from the 1.5 degrees, frankly, that we can afford. But yet, study after study points out that it is still possible to be there and to get there. So what do we need to do to repair this broken system? A bandage alone won't do it. We missed the opportunity during the financial crisis, where frankly, many people felt that banks were too big to fail, but people were too small to matter. I think now we have an opportunity to address this. Never ever have we been so forewarned about what is going to happen, but also forearmed with tools to do something about it. First and foremost, I would say it is actually a leadership crisis, not a crisis of climate change or inequality or food security. These are actually symptoms of a bigger crisis, of greed, of selfishness, of apathy that has crept into not only the private sector, but also in many parts of the governments around the world. So this is a break or make moment for history. And each of us needs to ask himself a very simple question. What part am I going to play in this? We have the roadmap, as I said, with the Sustainable Development Goals, but we also have the financial and economic arguments now to do something about it. Simply by the sheer fact that we have waited so long to address these issues of inequality and climate change, we have actually starting to incur costs that are higher by not acting than the cost that we would incur to avoid these issues in the first place. COVID is a good example of that. In Europe and the US alone, it has cost the economy $17 trillion. The IMF estimates $25 trillion is being wiped off the GDP this decade alone because of COVID. And we're nowhere near out of the woods. As you well know, COVID is a direct result of the destruction of biodiversity, the so-called zoonotic disease, like SARS, Ebola, Zika, Asian flu, and probably 3 or 4 waiting around the corner. Yet, to protect our biodiversity, to restore it, and to bring it more in harmony with planet Earth and future generations, if you want to, it would cost us infinitely less than the $17 trillion that we've spent now. The fact that the cost of not acting is now higher than the cost of acting is an enormous opportunity. And what we increasingly see is that companies that take the initiative, that start to act by putting a stronger purpose in their business, that focusing more on the longer term, that put this multi-stakeholder model in the middle and sustainability at the core of their strategy, increasingly there is evidence that these companies are better performing. There's also evidence that the ESG funds, the environmental, social, and governance funds, are better performing. So this is probably the biggest business opportunity that we're sitting at this time of humanity. And the world is starting to move. On climate, we saw major progress at the COP26 in Glasgow, where many nations and companies made commitments to get to a net zero environment well before deadlines needed and in line with the 1.5 degree challenge. We see it on nature, where so-called nature-based solutions are increasingly being talked and put on the agenda, not only in Glasgow, but now also at the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And we see it in food because of the rising food prices, the Ukraine crisis. We increasingly see a global awareness of the need to transform our food system. Not surprisingly, you talk climate, you talk food, which also includes the oceans, you talk nature, and directly or indirectly, you talk Peru. And everybody has a role to play in this. Governments need to put the right guardrails in place. Employees need to demand from companies that they work for that these companies change. Companies themselves need to limit those risks and seize these enormous opportunities. Investors need to de-risk their portfolios and finance these enormous ambitions that we have. And then the asset owners itself need to demand that their money is being spent in the right way. Increasingly, that is actually starting to happen. At the time of the pandemic, we had about 20 countries in the world making net zero commitments to decarbonize, Peru being one of them. Now we have 136 countries, 90% of the climate emissions making commitments. At the business level, we've seen a quarter of the business community making science-based target commitments. That's $38 trillion of money under management, with many of the other businesses not yet fully aligned with Paris, but making commitments on climate as well. We're seeing increasingly the financial market move. One of the key things coming out of Glasgow was the Global Financial Alliance of Net Zero, where $125 trillion of money under management pledged to decarbonize their portfolios. So if anybody doubts that things are not moving, here are the answers. And this is the case not only for the big industrialized countries that have the money to do it, but frankly, this is equally the case for many of the smaller countries in the world, which often are more nimble and could react faster to this. So Peru, and for Peru to survive, it needs to join the bandwagon. It needs to start to think what it means to have this sustainable vision, to move to a circular economy, to make it a more inclusive economic growth, to create the social equalities that we're striving for. Staying on the sideline is simply not an option. It would put you farther behind. It would create bigger issues than you currently have to deal with in your country. You decided to move from the horse and buggy to the car. You decided to embrace electricity and not stay with the candle. You decided to move to more attractive energy systems with 70% of your energy coming from hydro. Now is the time to lead also in the area of sustainability and to make not only your businesses, but after all, your country a more well-positioned and more prosperous part of this transformation that we need to work on. Now, I know it's not easy. It feels exhausting at times. There are so many issues coming at us. The funds are lacking. The cost might not be there. The issues are enormously complex. But I think that together we can actually solve the issues very much. There is no doubt that there is pushback from the vested order in the world. There is no doubt that politics has seized this agenda, especially here in the US, where I'm calling you from, but also in other places. That in some cases there is a high cost up front, that issues need to be attacked systemically. You cannot just have electric vehicles if you don't have the charging stations. And yes, in some cases we don't have the technology yet to solve all of our issues. Take, for example, hydrogen or fuels for airlines. But broadly, we can do much more than we're currently doing to accelerate this conversion. Study after study shows that about half of the possibilities are within our reach already this decade, and they're actually cheaper as well. And that is true for every country in the world, with a few exceptions. But for that, we not only need to be more ambitious as individual companies, we also need to embrace, as I said before, these enormous partnerships that we have. The reality is, most people are moving. Many people understand what needs to be done, but we're not moving at the speed and scale that is needed. And this is why we wrote the book Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. And you'll be pleased to hear that we just have issued the book in Spanish, and we'll be in Latin America for the Spanish tour to promote, obviously, the book. But more importantly, it's the thinking. Most companies right now are still in the CSR or corporate social responsibility mode, which is really the less bad mode. Less plastics in the ocean, less carbon emission, less deforestation. But the book will argue that if we have overshot these planetary boundaries to such an extent, less bad is simply not good enough anymore. I used to murder 10 people, now I murder 5 people. I'm not a better murderer. We need to start thinking regenerative, restorative, reparative. And the companies and governments that do that will position themselves well for the future. It is about doing less damage. It is about going beyond net zero. It is actually about making things better. In the book, we ask ourselves a very simple question. How can companies profit from solving the world's problems, not creating the world's problems? And is the world better off because my company is in it? Yes or no? For us, net positive companies take ownership of their total impact and consequences in the world, intended or not. Many companies still think they can outsource their value chain and also outsource their responsibilities. That doesn't work anymore. The net positive companies seek to have a benefit for the longer term, not just the short term, to seek a positive return for all of its stakeholders, not just its shareholders. They see shareholder value, which is important to achieve, but they see it as a result of what they do, not a myopic objective. And yes, these companies are involved in the broader changes that society needs. Now, in order to transform companies, to transform the society that we talked about, it really starts with transforming ourselves. Rumi, who was a 13th century poet in Iran, said it very well when he said, "Yesterday I was smart, I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, I'm changing myself." And this is really where everything starts. I believe we need a profound shift in the way that we think about business, the way that the role that we think business needs to play in society, and that we definitely have to move to becoming the trusted partner to drive these changes needed and to help de-risk actually the political process. This is a great moment for business. This is the business opportunity of the century. It will make you more profitable. It will position you better. Purpose, pace, and that is the case in all parts of the world, including Peru. And you'll just have to ask yourself the very simple question now, with the cost of action being so much less than the cost of action in many of the areas. If not now, when? And if not us, who? We simply owe it to ourselves, to our fellow citizens, and to our future generations. We'll open it up for discussion. Manuel, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Clear and strong messages and a good description even of our Peruvian reality. So the importance and the need to change, how much we have to build and strengthen leadership, and the role that the business sector should play in relation to that change. So that is strongly clear. So let me start this conversation by making you a couple of questions. The first one is, I think it was in 2019, you created a new entity, Imagine. It's a fantastic title. No, Imagine, it is about strengthening that leadership and mobilize actions to address the challenges that the planet is facing now. But also your book has a fantastic title that includes this phrase, giving more than take. So those, imagine and giving more than take, sounds like dreams. It is possible? How can we really do that? How a country as Peru can create that culture in which we are not imagine, imagining, but mobilizing action, but also giving more than take?
Yeah, first of all, imagine is, if, and you are right, Manuel, if you cannot think it and start creating it as a vision, you will never get there. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals help us imagine that this more sustainable and inclusive world is actually possible. But I've also realized after being 10 years CEO of Unilever that it's difficult for companies, small or big, to do things themselves, and that the major transformations need to happen with partnerships. So the reason we created Imagine is to bring together a critical mass of CEOs by industry sector across the value chain. We're doing that for food, we're doing that for fashion, we're doing that now for tourist and travel. In fact, all industries important to Peru as well. And what we see is that if we bring a critical mass of CEOs together, we can actually move things forward faster than alone. First of all, these CEOs collectively become more courageous, but we can also address these issues across the value chain that often bother us, because we have a higher level of trust, and we can collectively look at the economic value that can be unlocked. For example, to make that come alive, no company alone can solve the issues of plastics in the ocean, or move to regenerative agriculture, or get out of single-use plastics. These are things that have to be done with the whole value chain. So that is what we're doing with Imagine. And what we increasingly see is that companies that start to think restorative, regenerative, reparative are actually discovering enormous business opportunities. We see the food sector rapidly moving to regenerative agriculture. We have destroyed 70% of the land mass in the world and depleted the soil. We have cut down the forest to the extent that they become carbon emitters versus carbon sinks. We have depleted and warmed up and acidified the oceans to the level that we now have more plastics there than fish. So the industry has made a commitment to move to regenerative agriculture, to restore soil health, to repair nature. And once you start thinking that way, you actually discover enormous opportunities. And not only within business itself, but also to avoid these additional costs that you otherwise will have to deal with. So for Peru, I know it's not an easy environment that you're in. I know there are many challenges that need to be dealt with, but I frankly, I don't think you're an exception in the world, and you're sort of in the intermediate. In terms of the development index, you are sort of in the middle of the pack. You're around 70, I think, out of 180 countries that are being looked at. So whilst you have a difficult situation, also politically, I don't think you're actually that much worse off than many other countries in the world that are trying to look at these opportunities and try to seize them. Now, what needs to happen is very briefly, I think, is the first thing is there's no question that we need to keep focusing on bringing this pandemic under control and strengthening our healthcare systems. These are preconditions. I also think that even countries like Peru need to get the help from more of the developing countries. There's a lot of discussion, not only around climate change, but also in other areas, how we can redirect our international financial system to be sure that the countries that are more under pressure get some economic help. And a stronger voice from Peru there will undoubtedly help. There's also no question that business needs to step up to ensure that you have the right policies in place and the right governance. When the governance system is broken, when trust is so low, it is difficult to attack these challenges structurally. And that is also the case in Peru. But it is also important to point out that business has a key role to play. Very few businesses feel the need to get actively involved in government. And I understand that. But certainly business has an enormous interest in making sure that democratic systems function, that institutions function, that governments function. Because if you don't have these right structures in place, it's very difficult to even function as a business and to address these issues. So I know there is a certain level of fatigue going on, or that people start to feel overwhelmed by the issues that are there. But it is now the moment for business more than ever to step up and make their voices heard. And seeing this opportunity, not just as a cost that has to be dealt with, but increasingly, I think the main mindset shift will come from when they see it as an enormous opportunity to invest in. You know, I'll stop here, but Deloitte just did a recent study I saw just on climate change alone, and it pointed out that the cost over the next 50 years, if we don't take any action, would be $178 trillion to the global economy. Disproportionate, by the way, to countries like Peru. But if we actually attack it, we could have economic benefits of about $43 trillion. That's the magnitude on a global basis of the change. And that is the same for Peru. And we find that in any system. Countries that don't transform the energy system will end up paying 7 to 8 times more, as we now see with the prices of energy. Countries that don't transform the food system will end up paying significantly more. So it is important. It is important that we set these ambitions, that we set these higher challenges, and that probably starts with the business community embracing it, being aware of it, internalizing it in their own businesses, and then collectively working on ensuring that the governments are equally held to account here.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned when you talked about Imagine that the idea it is to convene a critical mass of CEOs. And let me say, this Peru Sustainable event, it is a good first step. But let me be clear, we haven't convened and created that critical mass of CEOs here in Peru. Mm-hmm. I am all the time wondering why. What do we need? And in your presentation, you mentioned we have to start to think, what does it mean? What does it mean, the challenge, and what does it mean to act? And also you mentioned that the cost of not acting, it is bigger than the cost of act. It is just about cost, or it is more than that? So what are those key elements for our audience to say to them, look, friends, be together, work together, be that critical mass. Even in this time in which we feel overwhelmed because of the political crisis, you can play a role. You have something to say. You have raised your voice also to to move policy and politics into something better. So what are those elements? It is just about cost, because it is clear that there is a cost. You know that in Peru, I think it has been the IDB that released a report saying that the benefits of having and acting towards a 2050 clear vision, it is $140 billion in these 30 years, or a bit less. And the ECLAC, or CEPAL in Spanish, said that the cost of not acting, it could be a structural loss of 25% of GDP by 2050. So it is clear that it is about cost. But it is more than that. What does it mean to be behind?
Yeah, I think the first one is a realization, as you rightfully say, that if we don't do anything, we will actually incur higher costs, which is now shown everywhere. We just finished a study in Indonesia because of the upcoming G20 there, and tried to do the same as what was done in Glasgow with South Africa to get the energy transition. As you know, Indonesia is heavily dependent on coal, and coal is probably one of the worst forms of energy for climate change. So what we are finding is, in work with Bapenas, which is their planning agency, that the economy already can grow 1.5% in the first year if you actually make this transition on an accelerated basis, because you have less of these negative externalities. We're also finding out that, like your Amazon, that the rainforest, the tropical forests that are still there, are probably the best opportunity to start playing in nature-based solutions, to become a leader in the carbon market. We've also started to put coalitions in place around blended financing there, because there are some risks that need to be taken. But because the people are getting together, working these issues at critical mass, others are being attracted and willing to take those risks. So the first thing I would say is have a realization of businesses that not acting is actually not an option for humanity, but not an option for your business to survive either. All food companies would be wiped out in the next 15 to 20 years if we don't change our food system. It's as simple as that. The second thing is a firm belief that companies have to be part of the solution, that this is not just a job of governments alone, that it has to be done together. In fact, I would argue that even in economies like Peru, it is especially the private sector that needs to step up. 95% of your business, your economy is made up of businesses, small businesses, SMEs, like, by the way, in most parts of the world. They are the bulk of your economy, the bulk of the job creation, the bulk of the financial flow. If they don't individually and collectively step up, we won't get there. So businesses need to understand these challenges, understand what it means for their businesses, and be aware of solutions that are there to actually see the opportunities. There are many organizations that can help you. The World Business Council, the UN Global Compact, the ICC are organizations that basically deal with small and medium-sized enterprises and have put a lot of tools out there to see how you can transform your business, how you can put purpose in the center, and how you can actually discover that there isn't a trade-off between purpose and profit, but that actually one enforces the other. There is no question, country after country, study after study, that shows that companies that are more purpose-driven, that embrace these challenges, make it an integral part of their business, have more motivated and energized employees, have more loyal and satisfied customers, have better relationships with their suppliers and communities, are more innovative, and all of that ultimately translates itself to better business outcomes. So it's that firm belief. And then you need to start to think about what I always say, Manuel, is we should not compete on the future of humanity. We really, if competition brought us to this problem that we are now facing, then cooperation might get us out of this. So we need to shift more areas to what I call pre-competitive and start to talk those together at industry associations, at organizations like I just mentioned. And this is exactly what we're trying to do with Imagine as well. But moving from competitive leadership, I would say, to cooperative leadership is a very important thing. And then last but not least, the easy way to start next to your own company, as we would argue in the book, is to start in your own value chains. There are many companies connected in a value chain, big companies and small companies. They all are making commitments, and to some extent, you want to stay connected to these value chains, including the global value chains, and that requires you to position yourself very well. And there you might find a lot of people willing to cooperate with you. Many of the major partnerships that we're now seeing, like the First Mover Coalition that is being developed by industry sector to accelerate the decarbonization move, the Tropical Forest Alliance that we're now seeing, or any other coalitions, are basically industry sector coalitions where people understand that it's better to solve the issue collectively than all going under collectively. So these are some of the ideas that I think would be equally valid for your business community.
Yeah. You know, Paul, that in some way you have raised a key message, because moving from competing to cooperate, it is so important, and that is happening in Europe because of the energy crisis. I think that Europe has been fully aware that they cannot be in the business as usual time of competing because of energy sources, but just to cooperate, and also to avoid to depend on a source of energy that it has geopolitical difficulties, as it is now with Russia. So we are entering into a new time of cooperation. But let me say something, and that is why the importance of your phrase. To move from competing to cooperate needs to have at least some conditions to cooperate. The point is that if we are not able to act and to recognize the need to strengthen our leadership, we won't be able to cooperate because we won't have resources to cooperate. And that, for me, is a key element. And the point is that if we put, for example, in the Pacific alliances, the different countries, Peru, it is the only one that has not developed the 2050 vision. Mexico, Colombia, Chile did it. No, are three important countries, neighbors, no, that have already defined how to move their economy into a 2050 time. Also, if we make a comparison for electric vehicles or new energy, as it is with Chile, with a hydrogen, green hydrogen plant, among some other good examples, it is clear that we are behind the others. So the point is that if we want to enter into a time of cooperation, we do need to raise our actions in relation to climate and nature responsibility. And that moves me to an important question. This is something for the audience that some time ago we talked with Paul. In my point of view, we are in a time in which we are entering into a new economy, a new global economy with a strong climate consideration. You replied me at that time that probably we are one step before. No, we are not yet there. We are in a time in which we are evaluating risk and taking action. But do you think that the world is going to enter into a new climate economy soon, in which the climate consideration will be a key and an important piece of our political, economic, and social decisions? I am a believer that, yes, Europe it is showing that. But I do want to know, what do you think? Because for me, that is a key element. You know, Paul, that I am used to saying, we have an agreement, great, the Paris Agreement, and we have to fulfill it. But friends, forget it. It is not about an agreement. It is about the economy. So I do want to have your reflection about this idea of a new economy that Peru has to understand well as a way to be part of that new economy. What do you think, Paul?
No, I'm writing it down. So the first thing I want to say is that the book talks about how to build trust, which is an important thing, what it requires to do that in terms of transparency, which I think is one of the main ingredients, in terms of working on a bigger vision than your own interest. We have two chapters on that. One chapter is 1 + 1 = 11, which is really partnership across industries and all that we talked about. And another chapter, which we call It Takes Three to Tango, where we talk about these bigger partnerships between civil society, governments, and the private sector. And they are difficult. Many of the partnerships in the world fail So it is hard work, but ultimately this is where you get the breakthroughs. And you have good examples of that. In Peru, the one thing that I remember is if your national parks, which is your legacy, was a partnership with WWF, as I talked about, many people in the private sectors, the Peruvian government. This was a good example where you also involved other countries to involve the financing. And you have other examples of that where you've actually led and are much better off. In areas that are important to you, which is agriculture, which is nature, which is your natural resources, which is fishery, these are the areas that you want to, mining, these are the areas that you want to actively lead in. Coming to your question, it's undoubtedly you need a vision. If you don't have a vision, you don't know where you're going. You don't want Peru to end up being the second-hand car sales place in America, or to be in Latin America, or to be energy dependent on the other countries because the only energy that's affordable is green energy, or to have an economy that cannot export anymore because the cost of producing it unsustainably are so high. An environment where more people live in poverty than the countries around you. I don't think you want to be there. So it is important that you have a vision, and it is important that business comes together, even if governments are currently to some extent failing, and I try to be direct here. It is important that business comes together and presents that vision. In Europe, even in Europe, in many areas, we see, and in Glasgow, we saw that very clearly, we see that we are currently at a moment where governments are moved to higher ambitions because the private sector is speaking up. Because the private sector is saying we can do it, but we also need the right regulation. We don't want perverse subsidies. We need the right enforcement. And then we can move much faster. And guess what? It's also better for all of us. It is when the private sector speaks up and say, we don't want to be part of corruption. For every corrupt government, there is probably someone in the private sector who corrupts. For every human right abuse, there's probably someone in our value chains that abuses the humans. So we as businesses really have to own these issues and step up to help keep governments to account. I'm actually optimistic that we are entering this climate economy that you're talking about, not only because of the economic opportunities, not only because technology is going much faster than often people are aware of, not only because of this cost of action and inaction, which makes it a very good thing also for the shareholders, but especially because of the young generation. The millennials, the Gen Zs, are very purpose-driven. They are demanding the seats at the table. They select the companies for who they want to work for now, and that undoubtedly is also coming to Peru. So the fact that Europe is moving with the Green Deal, the taxonomy, and setting the standards for many places in the world, like the Mercosur agreements with Europe, very much depend on sustainable implementation on natural capital, for example. Europe is setting the standards, but we've now seen with the US, with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically the biggest climate change agreement now, that puts the US on a trajectory of 45% reduction between now and 2030. We see it in Australia with the change of government, now very active on the global scene. We see it with Brazil probably after the elections, fingers crossed, that they are starting to treat the Amazons as a natural resource that could actually be creating wealth versus what they are seeing currently is destruction of wealth. So I believe that for all these reasons and more, that we're actually at the start of a tipping point. And in some industries, we're starting to see the tipping point already. Electric vehicles, wind, solar, agriculture, I think, we're starting to see movement happening at an accelerated pace. Humans have a hard time thinking exponential. We think linear. That was also probably why we underestimated COVID. It spread exponentially. But now people are starting to understand that we can't wait anymore, that we need to attack these issues, that we need to find the right balance between doing the right thing short term, but also taking care of our long-term future. You have a wonderful saying in Spanish that says, pan por hoy, hambre por mañana. You don't want to be in that situation. You need to be sure that we can feed the world's population now and for generations to come.
Yeah, interesting, because it is true. There is some element of a new climate economy, and you mentioned in your presentation a bigger order. Probably it is important to the audience to recognize that we are in a time, an amazing time, in which nobody is doubting on the vision that we have built. A vision in which 1.5 net zero and resilient world by 2050, and the decisive decade from 2020 to 2030, it is clear. Everybody's following the same. And I am used to using the analogy of a solar system. That for me, it is the main star. But also there are some gravitational forces. One of those, it is science-based target. We do need to have a clear vision and a clear target strongly based on science. Also, this is related to all of this discussion of the credibility of the climate claims. But it is not only about of that. The financial sector, it is changing their behavior. They have started to say no more money for coal investment, no more money for traditional fossil fuels, among some others. Also, we have some more information because of science. What IPCC is saying to us, it is clear. What is that expecting world that we could have if we are not able to promote and to mobilize change? And also, there are some other elements. So the point it is, how can we be part of that bigger order? What should we follow? Because if not, again, we could be behind the others. And the idea it is to put at least in the same level to enter into a time of cooperation. So what are those elements that are creating this bigger and new order for?
Yeah, I think you've captured it as well. I think the main element that drives this now is really the overwhelming issues that we're facing and the realization of these costs that come with it, and how it permeates all parts of society, from political stability to healthcare to biodiversity destruction or preservation, if you look at it the other way around. This really is about redesigning our economic systems in a way that it works for everybody. And business especially is not only well served to be a driver of that, but will also actually be one of the bigger benefiters from that. And I think in Peru, where you are now, the first thing that is required, if we like it or not, is to go together with the business community, with your industry associations, with forums like this, and say, how do we create the right environment? As I said before, you have to get a functioning government. Otherwise, it really doesn't work. If you go from crisis to crisis, it's not a way to live. It's not a way for you to run your businesses either. In fact, the business sector is one of the few sectors that is forecast to decline in investments in Peru. So together you need to think about what can you do to strengthen your institutions? What can you do to get rid of corruption? What can you do to put enforcement in place? You know what to do. You have enough experience of why that is better, but it cannot come in isolation from individual voices. It has to come from the strengths of the business community going together. When we saw COVID hitting Europe, or the Ukraine crisis, there was a tendency by the vested order to go back to the old way of doing things. Drill more holes to get oil, or open more coal plants, or not invest in the green economy, but support the brown economy. It is thanks to the voices of business getting together that we have seen governments change to more aggressive policies. I think you have a great influence on the way that the government in Peru ultimately can function. I also think that the population is ready for that. They might express it as the need for food, or the need for energy, or the need for jobs, because these are their immediate needs. But they certainly know that the current system is not working for them. With half the country, 43%, being in poverty, with still having over 10% of the children not in education, with a healthcare system that is in shambles, I think the population will want to see these improvements. And I think frankly, if you can come together with collective proposals that show that a lot of these things can be done without putting yourself in a financially unacceptable position, which I think is now possible, that would be the most constructive thing. And this is what we see working in most of the environments that we operate in, even in the tougher ones. And I use the example of Indonesia just as one of them.
Yeah, I know that we are running a bit out of time, but this is important because I am sure that in the audience, many people are thinking, okay, this sounds fantastic. No, I believe on it. But how can we do that when our economy, it is based, 3/4 of our economy, it is based in non-formal economic activities. People who is not paying taxes, people who doesn't have registers and all of that, the non-formal economy. And also with a strong SMEs. So what is your message, even in that situation, considering what you mentioned before, not to act, it is not an option?
You know, you have a strong informal sector. In fact, that's the bulk of your country, and that's obviously not the ideal situation. If you are an informal sector, you deal with low wages, you deal with lack of social protection or job security or pensions, you evade taxes, you fail to comply with safety and environmental standards, you violate property rights. Many of the issues, not different from counterfeit or corruption, these are things that erode societies over time. They don't strengthen societies over time. But at the same time, it's the reality of where you live in. And it would be naive to think that you can move your informal sector overnight to become a formal sector. But I do think that with the chambers of commerce, with industry associations like this, you actually can look at the broader picture and to figure out together with knowledge on the ground, more important than me, what can we do to move it forward in the right direction versus what probably currently is happening, regressing in the wrong direction. You know that ultimately is not going to put you in the best position. There are many developing countries that have a informal sector that is still large because that is probably a development stage you need to go through. I wouldn't worry about that too much. I would more focus on what can we do actually to create that right environment to increasingly make the informal sector more formal. And I tend to believe that as we deal with some of these challenges now that need to be addressed, that people that address these overtly, i.e. in the formal sector, and embrace those, will actually be more successful. And the more successful they are, I think the more evidence then that you have and also show why it is better to participate in the formal sector than in the informal sector. Not an easy challenge, undoubtedly, but that is certainly one of the issues that you need to attack head on to be successful longer term.
I would like to have to leave you the opportunity for a last message. But let me frame something for that last message. In Glasgow, I don't remember, we had thousands of people. Interesting because probably proxy, 50% parties, 50% non-state actors. And it is important to remind that started in Peru in 2014 with the Lima Paris action agenda. And that, as I mentioned in the beginning, that was one of those fantastic decisions of convening and bringing non-state actors into the table. So what is the message for Peruvian CEOs, for Peruvian business sector, based on the fact that we were able to do that in Lima in 2014? No, we created that room for having non-state actors into the climate debate, not only to be part as listeners or observers, but also to have them taking a strong action. So I would like to have your last reflection based on that thing that Peru did 7 years ago.
Well, you set the example, actually. As I said before, Manuel, you would not have been with the COP21. We would not have had a reasonable, successful COP26 or be at far along on the climate change agenda, were it not for you actively embracing the private sector. And I was honored to be part of that and having this parallel track. We have here negotiators that have locked themselves up in rooms for the last 26, 27 years and have probably lost touch with what is actually happening in society. And in that process, we have discovered that in many places of the world, the business community is actually running well ahead of the of the governments. And by creating this parallel track, i.e. this partnership to some extent, we have unlocked a lot of mindsets, which is where it really starts. We have set higher ambitions, which is the second step. But then we've also translated those ambitions increasingly in commitments and plans. And this is what you see at the country level now, where more countries are coming in with these nationally determined commitments, where more countries are making plans between now and 2030. And these countries that do attract the investments because they provide security. Business is willing to invest and make the longer term commitments. Others are willing to become parts of these partnerships. And it is that positive circle, if you want to, that is self-reinforcing, that you want to get Brazil in. I realize that it is very difficult right now at this moment to make that come from that initiative come from the government itself. It would make your life easier if it did. But frankly, in many countries in Europe, the initiative didn't come either from the government. In my country, the government had to lose a case in court where it's now a legal obligation to move legislation in line with the Paris Agreement. The government itself, frankly, didn't do anything. And it is thanks to holding them accountable in the legal system, which fortunately worked, that the government started to move. But it was the business community that actually took that initiative. And now you see the country moving quite aggressively. So what can you do together actually to change that environment that you operate in? And it starts with setting the example and then together bringing in the proposals. And I think there is a lot to borrow and steal with pride from other countries that are going or have gone through the same challenges. You're not alone here. And I think the international community also increasingly understands that you need the help also from the right organizations outside of Peru to get there. But in order to get that help, you also need to play a bigger role, I think, in some of these discussions at the more global level. Just like Manuel did at the time of the COP20, it brought Peru fully into the picture. But I also think with that, it created some alliances and some partnerships that frankly otherwise wouldn't have happened. But you played that global role, you were out there, and you attracted the right organizations to form these partnerships. So it is that process that we need to get going again at an accelerated pace in Peru and keep the country competitive and move it forward.
Thank you, Paul. You know that we could have stayed for longer time, but time is time, and we have to respect that. So this has been, as always, Paul, a fantastic conversation. Thank you for that. And key messages, no? The importance of change, the time in which we are entering, to cooperate, the importance of cooperate, and the importance of developing and enabling conditions to be able to cooperate. That is a key element. Not to act, it is not an option. And for me, something important for the audience. The business sector could play a role and should play, must play, to be more clear, a role, even in this time of political crisis, even in the current situation of a non-formal or informal economy. Because it is by having the business sector raising their voice and defining the vision for 2050 that we could overcome this time of crisis. And I am fully agree. So friends of the audience, I hope that the message it is clear. It is in your hands and you can do that. You have to do that. Thank you again, Paul, and I would like to ask to the audience for a big applause for Paul. Thank you very much. And now es momento de devolverle la palabra a Gianfranco y agradecerle a la audiencia y a Perú Sostenible por esta gran oportunidad. Muchísimas gracias y hasta pronto.
Muchas gracias. Hasta pronto.
Gracias Manuel, gracias Paul. La verdad que Paul nos deja una reflexión de cómo el sector privado puede y debe transformar la economía y los negocios hacia un modelo que contribuya a la solución de estos retos globales actuales, como el cambio climático, así como atender las desigualdades y la pérdida de la biodiversidad. Asegurémonos que nuestros negocios respeten el planeta. Con esto cerramos el día. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy. Nos vemos mañana a las 8:30.
Nosotros podemos ser
y debemos ser
la generación que lidera
la lucha contra la injusticia y la desigualdad.
Y lo conseguiremos
con los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible.
Para todos, en todo el país, sin dejar a nadie atrás.
Queremos vivir en un país
que avance en la lucha
contra la pobreza extrema.
Para que nadie, en ningún lugar,
se despierte por la mañana preguntando si hoy habrá algo para comer.
Queremos vivir en un país
en el que los servicios de salud
sean un derecho de por vida para todos.
Y en el que ningún niño tenga que morir
por una enfermedad que tiene cura.
Queremos vivir en un país
en el que todos puedan ir a la escuela
y desarrollen las capacidades necesarias
para enfrentar y vivir una vida plena.
Causaita Munanchis, Hoj Soyupi.
En el que todas las mujeres y niñas
tengan las mismas oportunidades
De progresar.
Y sentirse seguras y empoderadas.
No podemos lograrlo si se excluye a la mitad de la población.
Queremos vivir en un país
en el que todas las personas puedan tener agua limpia
y baños adecuados en la casa, en la escuela y en el trabajo.
un país en el que haya
energía sostenible para todos,
electricidad y luz en cada hogar.
Queremos vivir en un país
productivo
y que sigue creciendo,
creando trabajo digno para todos.
En un país
en el que nuestras industrias,
nuestra infraestructura
y nuestras innovaciones
no solo se desarrollan para generar crecimiento económico,
sino para mejorar nuestras vidas. Y un país
en el que los prejuicios y las desigualdades extremas
desaparezcan.
en el que la gente viva.
En ciudades y comunidades seguras.
resilientes y sostenibles.
Queremos vivir en un país
que estará revirtiendo decididamente
La amenaza del cambio climático.
En el que produciendo y consumiendo responsablemente
Protegeremos la vida de nuestros mares y océanos.
y restauraremos los bosques y la tierra misma.
Regenerando vida.
queremos vivir en un país
en el que haya paz.
a todo nivel entre ciudadanos y países,
en el que el gobierno esté al servicio del país.
justicia,
Y en donde trabajaremos juntos.
Con alianzas a todo nivel.
Para que estos objetivos mundiales se hagan realidad.
Estos son los objetivos mundiales.
Kaimi, Teximuyuntimpa Yayirikuna. Naciones Unidas Churamuscan, Objetivos de Desarrollo Nisca, Taripanapa.
pongámonos a trabajar.
Hagámoslo
Realidad.
La gestión sostenible. ¿Quieres conocer qué proyectos en nuestro país aportan a la protección y la gestión sostenible de los recursos naturales o impulsan acciones para hacer frente al cambio climático? Soy Bruno Ascenso y este jueves a las 6 de la tarde te invito a ser parte de la ceremonia de premiación del reconocimiento Perú por los ODS edición 2022. Ahí vas a conocer los proyectos de estas organizaciones finalistas en la categoría Planeta. Acompáñanos e inspírate con las iniciativas ganadoras de este año.